Back here on TYT Sports, second edition of our clip focusing around UFC 205, which will go down as the biggest card in history. Dana White, in his press conference after the fight, was celebrating, I think, a clear victory, moving the sport into New York City, something that has been kept out for whatever reason. I have no idea. Dirty politics was being thrown around in the press conferences, but it's clear that it was a success. No one died. No one faced anything harsher than I think you would see on an NFL field, so I don't think there's an argument to be made there that someone had a few black eyes and bruises. But we've got Robin in to discuss just kind of the logistics of what made this such a phenomenal card. So Robin, thanks again for joining us. Of course, the fight everyone's talking about is Conor McGregor and Eddie Alvarez. We already touched base on the logistics of that, so you can check out that clip. But do you think it was the collective card that made it what it was? Because we look at Wonderboy versus Woodley as just a remarkable example of heart, of technique, of two guys just leaving nothing to the imagination and giving everything. And then it ended up being a draw, something that was a little confusing. Yeah. I think Bruce Buffer had a Steve Harvey-esque moment where he announced something that wasn't. It didn't change much on the cards. He just announced a winner when it was actually a majority draw. But what was your take on that fight? And do you think with that fight, and then when you look at it, United Rejectric and her fight as well, like there was just a lot of real heart that was on this card before it led up to the remarkable example of Conor McGregor showing his showmanship and talent again.
Yeah, I think if you stack this card up with, fighter A versus fighter B that were no name, I honestly think you would have still had this level of pay-per-view because most of those people are tuning in to see the guy that they either love or they hate in McGregor and to see him chase after a second belt simultaneously. Mm-hmm. But for those of us that are watching the whole show, it really makes something beautiful. McGregor was on a card, the undercard, not that long ago, had Weidman versus Luke Rockhold. On another one, he had Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler, which was one of the great fights ever. He has been on cards with brilliant, brilliant fights. And this one had 2 championship fights. The Wonderboy Woodley fight, for me, it was a wonderful, wonderful fight. And fights, they ebb and they flow and they tell a story and they inspire you and they're scary. And there's all kinds of things that happen in a great fight. And this one was like that. You saw Woodley start out very, very strong and take down the mover. And once you put him on his back, when Woodley's on top of you, that's going to be brutal. And then you see the guy come back and start doing well in rounds 2 and 3 again and really start to show you what it is about him that's special. And that's movement, the striking, the way that he moves in and out, the way that he makes you nervous due to all the threats that he's showing. There's a whole bunch of stuff. But then in round 4, and which is why we had the draw, because round 4 was so one-sided that the judges gave it 10-8 for Woodley, which is why it ended up being a draw. In that, you saw Wonderboy get brutally rocked a couple of times and survive a choke. So now we get a story of heart and resilience and toughness and unwillingness to quit. And you get all of that so densely packed in one great fight for a title. That's an epic fight. Europeans and people from all over the world that watch football, they have no problem with a draw, a tie. This is normal. But North American fight fans, that's just unfinished business.
Yeah, I think that was what I was hearing around me, is because I was surrounded by fellow countrymen and Irishmen around. There was a lot of Scottish influence there, a lot of English, a lot of Irish. It was great to see everyone there. But they actually, most of them were probably too hammered by this point to even worry, but they were just like, it's a draw, great, let me see it again. Whereas I heard from the American fans where they were booing, they're like, we need to get this finished. And we'll get on to that, I think, as Tyron Woodley in the press conference was alluding to a Conor McGregor fight. I think he was being a businessman himself, understanding that it's something that's on the cards. I personally would love to see a Woodley Wonderboy too. I think it was just a phenomenal fight to see firsthand. But you're absolutely right. There was something about that fight that was just in a certain level of curiosity going around, because Wonderboy physically just doesn't look like a match up against a muscular, just ripped physique of Tyron Woodley. I saw him walk by and Jason was nudging me. I was captivated. This guy is just a machine. He looks like, very similar to Romero, they just look not human. They look like X-Men in a way. Wonderboy, he encompasses everything that I think a lot of fans of the sport really are drawn to, which is heart. Like, you can train yourself as much as you want, but Wonderboy has got talent, there's no doubt about that. And in the past, he's shown that he's very hard to hit and he's very flexible in the octagon. He can adjust, he can move, and he can hit you with several combinations. But Woodley imposed his physicality early on. And when a guy like that, as you mentioned, is on top of you and you're trying and you don't have the muscle mass that he has, it looked exhausting. When he was in that chokehold, I could feel myself trying to get air for him because it looked like it was just he was fighting a losing battle. But he showed grit, determination, some some of his ability to maneuver and squeeze his head free. Woodley blamed his head being too small, which was kind of funny in the press conference. But moving on from that, we kind of were, throughout this whole card, as you mentioned, everyone was going to tune in to see McGregor, which we know is a phenomenal fight. But there was just such versatility, I think, in some of these cards. Like, you have Weidman coming back from a brutal performance against Luke Rockhold, like a fight that many people said should have been stopped earlier on. It was just a real warrior match. And then he comes up against Romero, a man who's a very, very dangerous man. That's the only way I can describe him. Just dangerous, powerful, and he hits him with a knee that almost looked like it was a mistake in a way, but it clearly wasn't, because he was moving himself backwards, and it looked like he was trying to evade a Chris Weidman attack, a attack to try and take him to the ground, but still was able to land the knee. Like, how much does all of that go into making this card the biggest in UFC history? Because we had so much to add before we got to the main event.
Well, we're going to talk about, I mean, it's so tricky, right? Like, if we could talk only about McGregor and his impact, and yet we are here on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday morning, we're going to be talking about the event. And that's the perfect case scenario, right? Bring him in with McGregor and bring him out going, I got to see every event. And I think from the UFC standpoint, you can't have a better scenario than that. And let's say they average 5 people, there's 10 million people watching. If 8 million of those were only coming to see Conor McGregor, but they left going, man, the UFC is amazing, that is a success for the company. But for me, the fight obsessive, watching these fights showed me where fighting is going, and Woodley and Wonderboy was a part of that mobility and movement versus wrestling and boxing. But Bruce Lee once said, and I got it right here, pliability is life, rigidity is death, whether one speaks of a man's body, his mind, or his spirit. And when you look at kind of this, quote, old way, this Woodley, Alvarez, wrestler, boxer, it's rigid.
Yeah.
And you look at Wonderboy, and you look at McGregor, and you look at Tony Ferguson, and you look at Dominic Cruz and Demetrius Johnson, they're pliable.
Yeah.
And that is how they're winning. And that is how they're changing the game. But Woodley became much more pliable in his spirit, in his thinking, in the way he expressed his fighting. So he's already evolved past just being a rigid wrestler boxer, and we saw elements of that in that fight. So watching the game evolve, for me, is the beauty of watching a card like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It seems like in this sport, you need to be, as you mentioned in the previous clip, you need to adjust and you need to be moving with the times. So talking about that, some of the stats that we actually have here, as far as the numbers go, the gate brought in 17.7 million, which is a new UFC and Madison Square Garden record. The attendance was 20,427. Packed house, insane atmosphere. And this is one thing that I wanted to allude to as we move on to the next part of this discussion, next clip, is where does the UFC go from here and where does the main card fighters go from here? So we're going to obviously focus on McGregor. He is the winner. But the UFC as a whole, what I witnessed, there's so many new fans of this sport, and I think that's a fantastic thing. For anything to grow, you need to have these new fans. And yes, they may be coming in from McGregor, but this is why I think this guy is so remarkable, because we've had fighters emerging from Ireland and from the UK in the past, and they haven't been able to draw in this mass football audience who are going to watch Manchester United on the Saturday afternoon, are going to watch Celtic, are going to watch these fantastic soccer teams, and then they're going to watch Conor McGregor at night. They have no problem adjusting between both. And from what I've seen firsthand, the atmosphere, the electricity, it compared so much more so to any football match I've ever seen. It just kind of attached itself onto me to the thought where I need to come to the next one. Even if McGregor's not on it, I just need to be in this environment. And I think that's so fantastic for the sport. And that's why at the end of it, I was thinking to myself, why not arrange a Conor McGregor card at a stadium in either the United Kingdom or at Croke Park, like he was mentioning, in Ireland? Why not just get him to really blow the roof off this thing? Fill up a football stadium, something that's got so much character to it, like a Croke Park in Ireland, where people can just flood there in their masses and just come and watch this man take over. Do you think that's something that the UFC are going to look into? I know that Dana said he was, but I really think this would just finally push this sport to where it really should be.
Well, they're in the business of making money, and they're in the business of growing their thing. So it's definitely, there'll be logistical challenges, but that's the next stage for sure. But when I think about the why of all this, there are 2 things that come to mind that are very, very rare. One of them is an elite athlete or artist or performer or entertainer or, whatever it is you do, sing, dance, fight, play football. It's so rare that somebody is transcendently great. Okay, that's rare. It's also very, very rare in our society where we see somebody who has this star power and ability to capture people's imagination, to make them go mad with love or hate or admire or be obsessed with. And you can be obsessed with hating someone too. Those two things are incredibly rare.
Yeah.
So rare that if you ever have one of them in your sport or art, the whole thing grows. Conor McGregor is both of those things.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly rare. It's incredibly rare that you have somebody who's so mind-bogglingly good at your thing and has that ability to capture everybody's imagination. And he is both of those. And the UFC know that. And he knows that. So the big challenge now, I want to see him fight Khabib Nurmagomedov for the test of his skills and his growth as a martial artist. I want to see him fight Nate Diaz again. I want to see him fight Tony Ferguson, who's an improvisational fighter. Mm-hmm. I want to see him fight Tyron Woodley. I want to see all those fights. The UFC would like all those fights, but McGregor knows this. So he wants a piece of the UFC.
Yeah.
He wants equity in the thing. And so as much as my obsession is watching fighting, I'm going to have to be busy, and we're a 24-hour fight channel here at Fight Network. I'm going to have to be busy talking about the fight between lawyers and agents and Dana White and Conor McGregor, because that's his next play, is go and own a piece of the UFC. It's hard to deny when you have 4 of the 5 biggest pay-per-views ever, when you just did 17 million with him, when the whole world pays attention to him. He has the metrics. I mean, he's going to go on it. Me, as a fan, I feel ripped off because I want to see him fight every 6 weeks because I'm obsessed with watching and analyzing his fights. But he, as a human being, as a superstar, as a once-in-a-lifetime martial artist, as a incoming father, he wants to get paid. So I don't think we're going to see a fight for a while from Conor McGregor. I think we're going to have to watch him publicly do battle with a large company, unless they're smart too. They look and go, okay, fine. You want 10% equity? Let's do Croke Park with Nate Diaz 3, and we'll make enough money that it'll be worth it. So hopefully that's the way it goes.
Well, I'm sure that Dana White has got his business hat firmly on, as he always does, because as I was sitting in the press conference, everyone was asking McGregor what this announcement was, and he obviously declared that he's going to be a father, and then talked about how he's doing something that no one really in the sport can compare to. There's no comparisons anymore. There's always going to be comparisons, fighting technique and who's the best martial artist and who's the best boxer, all these things, all these logistics and attributes. But as for bringing in wealth to the company, he's obviously put himself in a league of his own, and that allows him, as much as many people will never want to understand and never want to look at how an athlete can be bigger than the sport itself, every sport has these type of athletes. You mentioned it earlier, which I wanted to kind of share my final point on, is every single sport in the world has athletes that come in. They're athletically transcendent. They're just top quality in terms of what they deliver week by week, so that you're captivated in them. Off the court, off the field, out of the octagon, they still manage to capture an audience. I put him in the same category. I think quality-wise, he is far superior than a lot of those players. That's why I like to make the comparison with the LeBrons and Cristiano Ronaldos. But in the fighting industry, the UFC hasn't seen anyone like this, that captures this mass audience, that is able to put on this show whenever the camera's on him. Not just when he's in the octagon, but whenever the camera's on him, he's continuing this showmanship. He's continuing, because he knows that every time a lens is focused on him, there is a ton of eyes on him, more so than Anderson Silva, than GSP, than anyone that was in the sport. So I think he is a businessman, and I think it would be smart for them to look into his request. And it's hard for, as you mentioned, for a human being to think that an organization like the UFC, with all their wealth, would look at a man that works technically for them, would look to try and give them the investment. But with any good employer, they would look at an employee that's thriving and offer them a raise or offer them another position. You got to think about it in that term. It's like it's a business like anyone else. He's fighting, he's an entertainer, he's doing what he's loving, but he's also moving this sport. He's moving mountains, literally, for them. So you got to keep up with them in order to keep them happy. And
to me, these guys are artists. Yes, they're professional athletes, but they're progressing the art. And there's music and there's rock bands and everything's normal. And then the Beatles come along.
Yeah.
And the Beatles, their music isn't the greatest music. People debate whether or not it's great, but what you can't debate is, for whatever reason, people go crazy for them.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, and you and I own the record company, and they are going to leave and start their own record company, and they are selling 80% of the records in the whole world of any kind, we give them a piece of the record company. Of course we would, right? So I think logistically that's the case. And I think it'll probably happen. There'll be debates back and forth. A bunch of lawyers will get rich in the meantime, but when things make sense, they make sense. And he's a smart man. You look at what this guy's done with the art of fighting. He's going art of war on his approach to the business as well. And that doesn't interest me as much, but it's something we better be ready to watch and talk about, because that's going to be part of the fight game over the next few months, is how the UFC and Conor McGregor make their business for it.
Yep, we'll be glued to the screens every step of the way, as we always are with Conor McGregor. But Robin, it really has been a pleasure to have you on. There's no one better out there for breaking down not just the physicality of the sport, but what it means outside of it. I think you really put it into a great perspective to how much it is an art and how much it means to a lot of fans out there. And I'm continuing to grow and love it in more ways than one. And I think that this sport it's in a great place. I think that Dana White is going to be a very happy man moving forward. Every single move that they make, they just seem to be pushing further, making more money, pleasing more fans, grabbing in a natural audience. I mean, you think about the old days in boxing where you used to have, imagine if social media was around when you have like Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield. There was ways to vocalize it, but I mean, you had a Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, even further back when you have Muhammad Ali fighting. That's what you're playing with now. You have a fighter that's so transcendent, and you have a social media and an atmosphere where everyone wants to share. And you go on Twitter after this fight, and every single fan, everyone that you're a fan of, actors, athletes, musicians, anyone, entrepreneurs, businessmen. I was so surprised Donald Trump wasn't tweeting about it. Like, it just seems like every single person in the world was just interacting with this fighter and interacting with this fight. And it's going to happen every step of the way. So, as you mentioned, you got to keep an eye on this, how the business side moves forward and how to keep Conor McGregor happy. But I'm a happy man to discuss this with you on a Monday morning. So make sure to check out the Fight Network, check out Robin on Twitter. We'll leave everything in the description below. It has been a pleasure, my friend, and I will see you guys very soon.